The clock on the dashboard showed 11:47 p.m. when Margaret finally turned onto Maple Street. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and she had to remind herself to breathe. 6 months. It had been exactly 6 months since she'd driven down this same street going the opposite direction. Her suitcase thrown in the back seat, tears streaming down her face. Now here she was, coming back to the house she'd abandoned, to the man she'd left without a proper explanation. She parked in the driveway instead of pulling into the garage. Something about parking in the garage felt too presumptuous, like she still belonged there. The porch light was on, which surprised her. David usually turned it off before bed, and it was nearly midnight. Maybe he'd forgotten. Or maybe, somehow, he knew she was coming. Margaret sat in the car for a full 10 minutes, just staring at the house. The rose bushes she'd planted 5 years ago were overgrown now, wild and untamed. The paint on the front door looked a bit more faded. Everything looked the same but slightly worn. Like time had continued without her, but hadn't quite moved forward either. Through the kitchen window, she could see a light on. Then she saw him. David was standing there, looking out into the darkness. Could he see her car? Her heart started racing. This was real now. She couldn't just sit here forever. She'd driven 12 hours straight to get here, rehearsing what she would say 1,000 times in her head. But now, actually seeing him, all those words seemed to disappear. Margaret opened the car door slowly, the sound seeming too loud in the quiet suburban night. A dog barked somewhere down the street. She could hear the crickets chirping, the same sound that used to lull her to sleep in the summers. Her legs felt weak as she walked up the pathway she'd walked 1,000,000 times before. The third stone from the left was still loose. She'd always meant to fix that. When she reached the front door, she realized she still had her keys in her purse. But using them felt wrong. This wasn't her home anymore, was it? She'd given up that right when she left. So she knocked instead, 3 soft taps that seemed to echo in her chest. The wait felt eternal. She could hear movement inside, footsteps approaching. Then the door opened, and there he was. David looked older somehow. There were more lines around his eyes, and his hair had gotten grayer at the temples. He was holding a coffee mug, and she noticed his hand was trembling slightly, making the liquid inside ripple. They stood there, staring at each other. Margaret had imagined this moment so many times. Sometimes she imagined him yelling, slamming the door in her face. Sometimes she imagined him breaking down, asking her why. But this silence, this frozen moment of mutual shock, she hadn't prepared for this. "Hi," she finally managed to say, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. David didn't respond right away. His eyes moved over her face like he was trying to make sure she was real, not some ghost or dream. She must have looked different to him too. She'd lost weight. Not in a healthy way, but in the way people do when they forget to eat because their mind is too full. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup. "It's late," David finally said, and his voice sounded rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "I know. I'm sorry. I couldn't wait until morning. I've been driving all day, and if I stopped, I was afraid I'd lose my courage." He stepped back from the door slightly but didn't invite her in. "Where have you been, Margaret?" The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't asked with anger exactly, but with a kind of exhausted confusion that somehow hurt more. "Can I come in, please? I know I don't deserve to ask, but I need to talk to you." David looked back into the house, then at her again. She could see him struggling with himself, weighing years of marriage against months of abandonment. Finally, he moved aside, opening the door wider. The house smelled the same, that particular scent of their home, a mixture of the vanilla candles she used to burn and the old wood floors and something else. That was just theirs. Margaret felt her throat tighten as she stepped inside. Everything looked almost exactly as she'd left it. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, the same throw blanket draped over the couch. "Coffee?" David asked, his voice flat. "Yes, please." They moved to the kitchen in awkward silence. Margaret sat at the table, in the chair that had always been hers, then immediately regretted it. Maybe she should have sat in a different spot. David poured her coffee, Remember without asking that she took it with just a little milk. No sugar. Some habits ran too deep to forget. He sat across from her in his spot, and they both cradled their mugs like they needed something to hold onto. I couldn't stay away, Margaret said, the words tumbling out. I tried. I thought if I just gave myself enough time, enough space, I could figure out how to be okay without coming back. But I can't. I'm not okay, David. I haven't been okay for a long time. David's jaw tightened. You left. You just left. No note, no explanation, nothing. Do you know what that did to me? To the kids? I know, she whispered, tears starting to fall. I know, and I'm so sorry. I was drowning, David. I woke up one morning, and I couldn't breathe. I looked at my life, and I didn't recognize myself anymore. I didn't know who I was outside of being your wife, the kids' mother, my parents' caretaker. I disappeared somewhere along the way. So you just ran away? That was your solution? It was the only thing I could think of to survive. The first 3 days after Margaret's return were strange and uncomfortable. She stayed in the guest bedroom, the one they used to joke about never having guests important enough to use. Now she was the guest in her own home. David gave her space, leaving for work early and coming home late. They moved around each other like careful dancers, trying not to bump into old wounds. On the fourth morning, Margaret woke up to find David sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea instead of his usual coffee. That's when she knew he was ready to talk. He only drank tea when he was upset or stressed. It was something his mother had taught him years ago. Tell me everything, he said simply, pushing a second cup of tea toward her. Not the short version you gave me that first night. I need to understand, Margaret. I need to know where you went and why you're back now. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup and took a deep breath. I drove to my sister's place first. You know, Rachel in Colorado. I stayed there for 2 weeks, crying most of the time. She didn't ask many questions at first. Just let me sleep and eat and exist without explaining myself. David nodded slowly, remembering Rachel. They'd always gotten along at family gatherings, but he'd never been particularly close to her. Rachel finally sat me down after those 2 weeks and told me I needed real help. Not just a place to hide, but actual professional help. She gave me the number of her therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen. I started seeing her twice a week. What did you talk about? David asked, his voice quieter now, less defensive. Everything. My childhood, our marriage, the kids, my parents. Dr. Chen asked me when was the last time I did something just for myself. Something that wasn't for you, or the children, or my mom and dad. I couldn't answer her. David, I sat there for 10 minutes, trying to think of one thing, and I came up blank. Margaret's voice cracked, and she took a sip of tea to steady herself. She asked me who I was, and all I could say was that I was your wife, a mother, a daughter taking care of aging parents. When she asked what I liked to do, what made me happy, I didn't have an answer. I'd forgotten, or maybe I never really knew. David sat back in his chair, processing this. You could have talked to me about this. We could have worked through it together. Could we have? Margaret asked gently, not accusing but genuinely questioning. Think about our conversations over the last few years. When did we ever talk about anything deeper than what to have for dinner or whose turn it was to visit my parents? When did we stop really seeing each other? The truth in her words hit David hard. He thought back to their daily routines, their mechanical interactions. Good morning kisses that became habit rather than affection. Conversations about bills and schedules and household repairs. When had they stopped talking about dreams and fears and hopes? After a month with Rachel, I needed more space, Margaret continued. I found a small cabin in Montana, this tiny place near a lake. It was quiet there, peaceful. I could hear myself think for the first time in years. One rented it month by month, working remotely online doing data entry jobs just to pay for it and basic expenses. Montana. David repeated, shaking his head. You were in Montana this whole time? Most of it, yes. I kept going to therapy through video calls. Dr. Chen had me start journaling, writing about my life, my feelings, who I wanted to be. I filled 7 notebooks, David, 7. All these thoughts and feelings I've been pushing down for decades just poured out. She got up and retrieved her bag from the guest room, pulling out several worn notebooks. She handed them to David. You can read them if you want. I wrote about you, about us. Some of it isn't easy to read. Some of it's angry. Some of it's sad. But it's all honest. David held the notebooks like they were fragile things that might break. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. That's okay. They're here when you are. Margaret sat back down. I also wrote about the good times. Our first date, when you took me to that terrible restaurant with the singing waiters. And we laughed so hard we couldn't eat. When the kids were born. The trip we took to the beach for our 10th anniversary. Those memories are still there, David. They're not erased by the hard times. So why come back? David asked, the question he'd been holding onto for days. If you found peace in Montana, if you figured out who you were, why not just stay there? Why come back to all this mess? Margaret looked him straight in the eyes. Because I realized something important. Finding myself didn't mean losing you. I spent months thinking I had to choose between being me and being your wife. But that was never true. I just needed to figure out how to be both. She paused, gathering her thoughts. And because I love you, David, even when I was running away, even when I was angry and lost and confused, I still loved you. That never stopped. I just needed to learn how to love myself too. David felt tears forming in his eyes. The first real emotion he'd let himself feel since she'd shown up at the door. You hurt me, Margaret. You hurt the kids. I spent months not knowing if you were alive or dead. Do you know how many times I called your phone? Just to hear your voicemail message because I missed your voice? I know, she said softly. And I can't undo that. I can't take back the pain I caused. All I can do is try to make things right now, if you'll let me. I'm not asking to just pick up where we left off. I know that's impossible. But maybe we can start fresh, build something new from what's left. David called the kids on Thursday evening. Margaret could hear him from the guest room, his voice low and serious as he spoke first to their daughter, then to their son. She couldn't make out the exact words, but she heard the tone shift from explanatory to defensive to tired. When he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a long moment before telling Margaret they were coming over on Saturday. Saturday morning arrived with gray skies that threatened rain. Margaret woke up early, unable to sleep past 5. She made breakfast, then threw most of it away, too nervous to eat. She changed her outfit 3 times, finally settling on simple jeans and a blue sweater. Nothing too fancy, nothing that looked like she was trying too hard. Their daughter Lisa arrived first, at exactly 10 o'clock. Margaret watched from the window as Lisa sat in her car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel. When she finally got out, her face was set in a hard expression that Margaret had never seen before. Lisa walked past her father's hug stiffly and stopped at the doorway, refusing to come inside. I'm not doing this, Lisa said, her voice shaking. I only came because Dad asked me to. But I can't go in there and pretend everything's fine. Margaret came to the door but kept her distance. I'm not asking you to pretend anything's fine, sweetheart. Don't call me that, Lisa snapped. You don't get to call me that anymore. The words stung, but Margaret nodded. Okay, I understand you're angry. Angry? Lisa's voice rose. Angry doesn't even begin to cover it, Mom. Do you know what it was like? Dad called me at 2 in the morning, crying, asking if I'd heard from you. I thought you were dead. I thought someone had taken you or you'd been in an accident. I filed a missing person report. I called hospitals for 3 weeks straight. Margaret felt tears rolling down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Lisa. I should have called. I should have let you know I was safe. There's no excuse for what I put you through. You're right, there isn't, Lisa said. I had my engagement party last month. The biggest moment of my life so far, and my mother wasn't there. Kelly's mom was there, fussing over everything, taking pictures, crying happy tears. And where were you? Off finding yourself in some cabin somewhere while your family fell apart. David stepped forward. Lisa, please no. Dad, you asked me to come. I came. But I'm not ready for this. Lisa looked at Margaret one more time. I got a promotion at work 3 months ago, something I've been working toward for 2 years. I wanted to call you so badly. Even after everything, even being angry, my first instinct was to share it with my mom. But you weren't there. You chose not to be there. With that, Lisa turned and walked back to her car. Margaret started to follow, but David gently caught her arm. Let her go. She needs time. They watched Lisa drive away, and Margaret sank down onto the front steps, her whole body shaking with sobs. David sat beside her, not touching her but present. They stayed like that until their son's car pulled up 20 minutes later. Thomas got out of his car slowly, taking in the scene of his mother crying on the steps and his father sitting helplessly beside her. Unlike his sister, Thomas came forward without hesitation. He sat down on Margaret's other side. Rough morning? He asked quietly. Margaret let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Your sister hates me. She doesn't hate you, Thomas said. She's hurt. There's a difference. They sat in silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again. Can I ask you something, Mom? And will you give me an honest answer? Anything, Margaret said, wiping her eyes. Did you ever feel like you couldn't breathe? Like the walls were closing in, and if you didn't get out right that second, you'd just disappear completely? Margaret turned to look at her son, really look at him. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. Yes, exactly like that. Thomas nodded slowly. I get that. I mean, I never left or anything, but I get that feeling. Sometimes I'm sitting in my apartment, and I look around at my life, and I wonder who decided all this for me. Like I'm following some script someone else wrote. Have you talked to anyone about this? Margaret asked, her mother instincts kicking in despite everything. Started therapy 2 months ago, actually, Thomas said. After Dad told me you left, I realized I've been having these same feelings. Not as intense maybe, but they were there. I figured if I didn't deal with them now, maybe I'd end up running away to someday. David looked at his son with surprise. You never told me you were in therapy. Thomas shrugged. You had enough on your plate. Besides, it felt like something I needed to do for myself, you know? Not for anyone else. Margaret felt a strange mixture of pride and guilt. Her son was taking care of his mental health. But had it taken her breakdown for him to realize he needed to? I'm not saying what you did was okay, Mom, Thomas continued. Lisa's right to be angry. Dad's right to be hurt. You left us all scrambling to figure out what went wrong. But I also think I understand why you did it, even if I wish you'd done it differently. I should have gotten help sooner, Margaret said. I should have talked to someone, to your father, to a therapist. Before it got to the breaking point, I should have been honest about struggling instead of just running away. Yeah, you should have. Thomas agreed. But you're here now. That counts for something. They moved inside finally, the three of them settling in the living room with coffee and tea. Thomas asked Margaret about therapy, about what she'd learned, about her plans going forward. He listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions. David watched this interaction, seeing a maturity in his son he hadn't noticed before. Thomas had grown up somewhere along the way, had learned to handle difficult emotions with grace. 3 weeks had passed since that difficult Saturday morning. Margaret had settled into an uncomfortable routine, still sleeping in the guest room, still moving carefully around David like they were strangers learning each other's patterns. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. David came home from work to find Margaret packing her suitcase on the bed. His stomach dropped. The coffee mug he was holding nearly slipped from his hand. Here it was again, the abandonment he'd been bracing himself for since the night she returned. She was leaving. Of course she was leaving. Why had he let himself hope things might be different? So that's it then? He said, trying to keep his voice steady but failing. You're running away again? Margaret looked up, surprised by the pain in his voice. David, no. It's not like that. Then what is it like? He asked, gesturing to the suitcase. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like last time. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed and motioned for him to sit beside her. He hesitated, then perched on the opposite end, as far from her as possible while still technically sitting together. I found an apartment, she said gently. A small one-bedroom place about 15 minutes from here, over on Oak Street. I signed the lease yesterday. David felt like someone had punched him in the chest. I don't understand. I thought you came back because you wanted to fix things. You said you wanted to try again. I do want to try, Margaret said. But David, we can't just go back to how things were. That version of our marriage wasn't working. We both know it. If I stay here right now, we'll just fall into the same old patterns. The same roles, the same problems, just with more resentment piled on top. So your solution is to leave? Again, my solution is to give us both space to figure out who we are now, Margaret explained. I need my own place where I can continue working on myself. And you need time to process everything that's happened without me being here as a constant reminder. David stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. Outside, the neighbor was mowing his lawn, completely oblivious to the conversation happening in this bedroom. Normal life continuing while his world shifted again. I'm not disappearing, Margaret said softly. I'm staying in town. I'm staying in your life, if you'll let me. But I think we need to start over completely. Not as husband and wife trying to patch up a broken marriage, but as to people getting to know each other again. That doesn't make any sense, David said. Though his voice had lost some of its edge, Margaret came to stand beside him at the window, careful not to touch him. When we got married, I was 22 years old. You were 24. We were kids, David. We grew up together, had children together, built a whole life together. But somewhere in all of that, we stopped seeing each other as individuals. I became just the wife and you became just the husband. We were roles playing roles. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I want to date you, David. Real dates. Where we dress up and meet at restaurants and talk about our days like people do when they're getting to know each other. I want to tell you about the book I'm reading and have you actually listen because you're interested, not because you feel obligated. I want to learn what you think about things, what you dream about, what scares you. We're married, David said flatly. We've been married for 23 years. This is ridiculous, is it? Margaret challenged gently. When's the last time we went on a real date? Not a dinner out of obligation or because it was our anniversary. When's the last time we talked about anything that mattered? When's the last time you told me about something you were excited about, and I didn't immediately turn it into a discussion about the kids or the bills? Or my parents' health? David was quiet because he couldn't remember. The truth was painful but undeniable. I found a job too, Margaret continued. Part-time at a bookstore downtown. It starts next week. It's not much, but it's mine. I'll be earning my own money, paying my own rent, taking care of myself. And maybe, while I'm doing that, we can figure out if we actually want to be together or if we've just been together out of habit. In fear of change, I want to be together, David said quietly. Do you? Or do you just want things to go back to normal because change is scary? The question hung in the air between them. David turned to face her finally. I don't know anymore. A month ago, I would have said I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted my wife back, my life back, everything back to the way it was. But you're right. The way it was wasn't actually that good, was it? We were just going through the motions. Margaret nodded. I've been thinking about this a lot. In therapy, Dr. Chen asked me if I love you or if I love the security of being married. At first, I was offended by the question, but then I really sat with it. And the truth is, I do love you, David. I love the man you are, not just the role you play in my life. But I need to make sure of that. I need to choose you deliberately, not just stay with you by default. And what if we go through all this and you decide you don't want to be married to me anymore? David asked, his voice breaking slightly. Then at least we'll both know the truth. Margaret said honestly. And maybe we can part as friends instead of two people who stayed together out of obligation, until we couldn't stand each other anymore. David walked back to the bed and sat down heavily. So how does this work? We just start dating like strangers? Not strangers, Margaret corrected. Like to people who care about each other and want to see if they can build something real and honest and healthy together.